This is, usually the point at which the moderator says, I'm with a man who needs no introduction, and then they go on to introduce the subject for 15 minutes. But I feel I'm truly with someone who doesn't need an introduction, and I'm sure everyone in the audience is very well aware of your multi-hyphenate achievements. So can we just have another round of applause, and then we'll start? Okay, I must confess, I had a bit of unnatural help in preparing for this session because a former chief of staff of yours was a former colleague of mine. So I know things like you like Marmite and that you're an idli connoisseur.
That's true.
And your breakfast hasn't changed in 12 years. But we won't get into the embarrassing stuff. We'll start with the easy stuff.
It hasn't changed in 60 years.
60, okay.
Idli's all my life, yeah.
To start with, and I might put you in a bit of a spot here, but I think you'll emerge with winning colors. Could we have a perfect Tharoorism for the gathering right now? I know you wrote a book called The Tharoorosaurus during COVID, so maybe something from there. But a Tharoorism for this gathering and where we are right now.
No, it's a wonderful, vibrant crowd, full of energy. But some of you seem to want to enjoy your own conversations. If you can hold those for an hour, we can get ours done, and you can still hear. Take care.
Okay. So I want to start with a question that was actually from the students at Alliance University. A lot of them got together to prepare a few for you.
Okay.
And in continuation with, what was said at the inauguration right now, and I think this question is a great one for you to answer specifically because at 22 you received a PhD in international relations. I think you were the youngest ever to receive a PhD at the Fletcher School at Tufts. What are your thoughts on the idea of, a liberal arts education or a trans-disciplinary education, which was, something that we just spoke about 10 minutes ago?
Yeah, well, I'm actually a huge fan of the liberal arts education process, and I congratulate Alliance University for starting a school of liberal arts, because in our country, I frequently find myself at convocations and prize givings at both schools and colleges. And I find that our parents have so indoctrinated kids into focusing on the sciences that if I ask 100 people, so what you're going to be doing next, 99 of them will give me an answer that involves science or mathematics or technology. And I think that's all very well, and surely our country needs all of that to get ahead, but it's not enough. And the reason it's not enough is that the scientific disciplines essentially deal with a world of certitudes. That is, this plus this has to equal that. You switch this on and that happens. Such and such a thing produces that reaction. Everything is black and white. It's a world of absolutes. Whereas the real world is not like that. The real world is a world of grays. The real world is one where incertitude reigns, where when people talk to each other, they discover that with the same data, they may have totally different conclusions, or they may bring different experiences and different assumptions to their understanding of a particular problem. Liberal arts is what teaches all of you how the world really is. It's complicated, it's messy, it's nuanced. It expands your horizons, it takes you beyond the binaries of the science and technology world. It takes you into a world which is much more like our real world. Now, I know the technologists and engineers here are going to push back and say, but ours is the real world, this is a world of dazzling technological change. You're right, but that's precisely why you need liberal arts, because there's a study by the Oxford Martin School that says in 2030, 30% of the jobs in the world will be jobs that don't exist today. Now, how on earth is a university going to prepare you scientists and technologists for a job that doesn't exist using technologies that don't exist because they haven't been invented yet? Why you need the liberal arts is liberal arts doesn't teach you what to think. It teaches you how to think. It teaches you to look at the world with all its incertitudes, to look at the various options and possibilities and nuances that are out there. And that gives you the flexibility to apply your mind to something totally new when it comes your way without being intimidated, because that's what you've been doing all your university life. Whereas people who've dealt in absolutes find that much more difficult to adjust to. And woe betide a world in which scientists, technologists, and engineers also get into politics and public policy. There was a terrible study at Oxford in the late 90s, or beginning of the 20th century, of the 21st century, which established that though not all engineers are terrorists, 95% of every known terrorist to that date, 2005 or 6, 95% of them had studied engineering. And it's simply because engineering doesn't admit of anything but an absolute truth. And they applied that mindset to politics, to their faith, to their convictions. And they said, this is the only way it's got to be. Everybody else is wrong. Kill them. That's why terrorism came out of that background. Now, I'm not suggesting all of you are going to turn that way, but the fact still is that that study was revelatory of one of the problems with the technological mindset. I'm being a bit mischievous, but it's an absolute study. You can Google it.
I fear there might be a few withdrawals from the engineering department after this.
I hope not. But if they join the liberal arts school, it's okay. No loss.
So among the many hats you wear, you've always said in the past that you're foremost a man of letters. I read an interview in which you said you're already a former minister.
Already a former minister. One day I'll be a former MP. But I hope never to be a former writer. Yeah.
So tell us, I mean, since this is the Alliance Literary Festival, and we will be speaking about brave new ideas, but to start off with also, tell us about what the identity of writer means to you and why it's important, despite your busy schedule, to make time to attend literary festivals, of which you are everywhere, and continue to write these books. You've written 23, and I'm sure there'll be, 10 more in the next 10 years. So what does this identity mean to you?
Actually, the 10 more in the next 10 years looks increasingly unlikely with the pace of demands from the writing world and the columns I write and the politics of being a Lok Sabha MP, incredibly time consuming. So I have to admit that I'm, for the first time, really way behind on a book commitment this year, and I suspect there'll be a knock-on effect in future. So don't count on 10 more, but even a couple more in a sort of distant horizon would be a dream I'd love to fulfill. But coming back to what does being a writer mean? I mean, I think I'm still the same human being who's been in politics, who's been in world affairs, who's been in public policy, who writes columns. As a human being, you have a number of reactions to the world you see around you. And I think the only difference that a writer has is that he or she feels an urge to express that reaction, not just in their work, not just in what they do, not just in their living room conversations, but through words that reach strangers. And that is an urge that is impossible to explain. I think George Bernard Shaw put it far better than I could when he said, I write for the same reason that a cow gives milk. And when you think about it, a cow gives milk naturally, and she would be in real pain if she weren't milked. There's something inside you, it's got to come out. And that's what most writers feel. I mean, why on earth, at the end of an exhausting day, do I sit down at 11 o'clock at night and write for a couple of hours? Because if I didn't, I wouldn't sleep very well. I would feel that a part of my psyche were withering on the vine.
So among, the various different kinds of writing that you do, because it's not just the novels and the non-fiction books, it's also a lot of opinion pieces, essays. I'm sure there's a lot of policy documents that you need to author, and you're a prolific tweeter as well. But there's a certain longevity that a book has, that all these other kinds of writing, though, despite all their virality, a book lives forever, or, as long as, unless publishers like Westland shut down, a book lives forever. So what do you bring differently to novel writing or to, book writing than to, say, an op-ed piece? What does that longevity mean to you? Does it make you think harder and deeper? Does it make you want to introspect in ways that that idea has a longer shelf life than an op-ed piece?
Yes, I mean, there's also the mechanics of the process. A column is usually restricted in terms of words. You've been an editor, and I'm sure you've turned to writers that this is too long.
800 words.
Exactly. I tend not to do too many 600-word pieces, but even 1,000 words. So you find, at least in my case, my first draft is always too long. And because I don't yet trust editors, sorry, Anindita, I do end up cutting it down myself, and I always leave out things, which, to my mind, is one of the constraints that a book doesn't have. In a book, if you have a thought, you can expatiate on it to the length that thought merits. Sometimes it could be very short, sometimes it could be much longer, whereas in a publication, you are limited by an artificial word limit, ceiling. And that's essentially, I would say, the major difference. Fiction, of course, is a totally different art. And with fiction, I mean, it reminds me of that beer commercial from the 90s about the beer that reaches places that other beers don't reach. Fiction reaches places in the reader that other kinds of writing doesn't reach.
Yeah, very well said.
And for that, if you want to describe an argument, to put forward a point of view, to persuade somebody, you're reaching out to their mind. And I think non-fiction and essay writing is the best way to do that. But if you want to touch somebody's heart, if you want to seize their imagination, if you want to get them thinking about things for longer, very often fiction has that beguiling quality of entering people's consciousness through the medium of story. And that makes a very big difference.
Right. So you've had a very early start. You wrote your first story at 6. It was published when you were 10. And then you serialized a novel at the age of 11. This is all on the wiki page and more. How important was early parental support for you? You've spoken a lot about how your father supported you. And I think only very recently you've also spoken about your mother's contribution in this. Do young writers need that early familial support and encouragement, or can you survive in spite of that?
Right. Well, I mean, the fact is, when a child is doing anything, parental support is indispensable. If for no other reason than to make the child feel that the effort is worthwhile. So I was an asthmatic child in an India without television, Nintendo, PlayStation, mobile phones, laptop computers, nothing. So when you're sitting up in bed, propped up against pillows, struggling to breathe, and this was in India before inhalers as well, so asthma was a pretty serious condition. You really couldn't just lie back and take a couple of puffs and doze off. I was up a lot of the day and really struggling for something as basic as my breath. My mind was alert and awake, and it needed to be occupied, and so books were the way I turned. So I turned to my parents' books. I was the eldest child in the family, so I didn't have elder brothers and sisters whose books I could borrow. And having read my parents' books, usually when I was far too young to understand them fully, but I still got into the habit of turning to books for my entertainment, for my escape from my sufferings, and for my education. And so I ended up with being somebody who was immersed in books. And when I ran out of books completely, and I was an inconveniently fast reader, so I would finish library books in the car on the way home in Bombay traffic, growing up at that time. So when I ran out of things to read, I tried to write. I mean, there were two things I did. I played book cricket, took the fattest volume in my father's shelves and opened the pages at random, and the last digit was the score of that particular ball. I'm not sure anyone here is old enough to have played that sport, but I did, and there are many others of my vintage who did. And the other thing I did was I wrote. And I wrote initially very derivative stories. They were imitative of the Enid Blyton stories I read. What I wrote, I remember Enid Blyton's 5 Find Outers was a favorite, more than the famous 5. And there was the Secret 7 and so on. So for some reason, she didn't have anything with 6. So I invented the 6 Solvers, who were a bunch of Indian kids who would go off to a Kerala village on vacations every year, the way in which my parents would drag my sisters and me off to their ancestral villages. And they would solve mysteries very much like the Enid Blyton ones. Unfortunately, those never got published anywhere. But as my reading taste expanded, so did my writing attempts. And I was a big fan of the Biggles books by Captain W.E. Johns about this intrepid airman whose career began in the First World War and continued well into the Cold War. And so I invented an Anglo-Indian fighter pilot who saves London from Germans in World War II and all this nonsense. And that was what was serialized starting a week before my 11th birthday. So in some ways, I think it confirms that one really learns about writing by doing it. You don't really, it seems to me, you can't teach writing. Forgive me if there are people who offer writing courses. I think what you have to do is write, test your writing against, of course, the tastes of editors and also the feedback of readers. I wrote extensively in every Indian English language magazine available, including Eve's Weekly and Chandamama and all of those. Illustrated Weekly, of course, was the prize catch. But you wrote for these publications, and they were being read by your parents' friends and neighbors and They would come and give you feedback and tell you this was a terrible joke, or this was, what was that word, we didn't understand it, or whatever it may be. And through the feedback, you refined the kind of style and content you did. So I learned, literally, it was an apprenticeship with a large public as my instructor. I've forgotten the question already, but my answer's gone all over the place.
It was a wonderful answer.
That's more or less what I did.
Moving to, your adult writing, I find that there are, a couple of themes that you've returned to repeatedly. The idea of Hinduism today, Why I Am a Hindu, the book you wrote in 2018, and you had a follow-up in the next year, The Hindu Way, where, it seems to me the kind of central conceit is that you make a distinction between Hinduism, the inclusive faith of spirit, and a deviant variety, political Hinduism. And the other theme is, of course, presenting your idea of India, and how that's changed. But on Hinduism, do you think the books and your writing are a way to kind of show the world and Indians a return to, the vast faith that Hinduism really is? I know that you yourself have said you're a practicing devout Hindu, you're a Ganpati fan, you have 200 figurines. So why is it important for you to sort of correct this, this kind of new vigilante image of Hinduism that seems to be the more popular version right now?
Well, the truth is, Anindita, that I grew up at a time when religion was your private business. Yes, my family dragged me off in pilgrimages and took me to temples, but there was no particular need to talk about it because everybody was entitled to their own faith, their own belief, their own practice. I mentioned this for the first time in a book in India from Midnight to the Millennium, over a couple of pages only, in reaction to what had happened at that point to the Babri Masjid in '92 and the riots that followed and all of that, and the rise of Hindutva, which deeply troubled me. Though I was living abroad at the time, I was intimately following events in India. It's only after I came back to India, entered Indian politics and public life, and saw what the BJP and its assorted members of the Parivar were doing to use my precious faith as a political instrument for their own advancement, that I began to really get troubled and angry about it. And so, Why I'm a Hindu was very much a political reiteration of my beliefs at some length as a repudiation of Hindutva, the political doctrine, which I believe is actually a profound betrayal of Hinduism. My Hinduism has come from extensive readings, not only from worship, because, as Swami Vivekananda was this great exponent of Hinduism in the English language, and I must admit, I don't read, I can physically read the words in Sanskrit, but I can't understand them.
You've read the Upanishads, right?
I've read translations of the Upanishads in English, I've read translations of commentaries on the Gita and many other works in English. There are very good translations and not so good translations available of pretty much every major sacred text. Not everything, but certainly when you realize that even Adi Shankara in 1000 AD had so many texts to deal with that he confined himself to a certain limited number of books as what he was essentially putting across as essential Hinduism. That's one of the great strengths of Hinduism. There's an eclectic range of beliefs, philosophies, ideas out there. Including materialism and atheism, are part of the accepted schools of Hindu philosophy. And all that Hinduism says is you choose your way of belief. People don't often realize that the original idea of the Hindu faith of Godhead was of the Nirguna Brahman. The Brahman, the divine, without qualities, without form, without shape, without gender, very much like the Islamic idea of God. But the rishis realized over hundreds of years of practice that this wasn't working because people needed something more tangible. People started worshipping rivers and trees and mountains. So that's when the Hindu thinkers and philosophers came up with the idea of the Saguna Brahman, divinity with qualities. But precisely because, unlike other faiths, they said very bluntly and realistically, no one knows what shape or form or gender or anything else the divine has. You are free to imagine the divine in any way that you wish. Which meant that if you want to think of the divine as an 8-armed woman riding a tiger, Durga, you're welcome to do so. If you want to think of the divine or want to focus your worship on a pot-bellied man with an elephant head, Ganapati Ganesh, you're free to do so. And by the same logic, if you want to imagine the divine as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, that is also acceptable. And that's something that Swami Vivekananda in his lectures would constantly make this point, that ultimately this was what Hinduism was about. He said in Chicago in his famous address to the World Parliament of Religions, "I'm proud to speak here on behalf of a faith that teaches not just tolerance but acceptance." And you know, I heard that, I read that when I was in my teens, and it stayed with me all my life. I kept thinking about it because it's a very profound idea. I studied history in school and college, and you learned that tolerance was a virtue. A tolerant king was a good guy because he was tolerating opinions that were different from his. But the truth is that tolerance is actually a very patronizing idea. Tolerance says what? I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's all that tolerance is. Whereas acceptance, which is what Swami Vivekananda tells us Hinduism is about, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And that to my mind is the best recipe for a multi-religious, multicultural, multi-party democracy, a pluralist society like ours and a democracy like ours. And that philosophy of acceptance is what is being betrayed by those who have taken the soaring majesty of Hindu philosophy and reduced it to something more like the team identity of the British football hooligan. You know, it says, this is my team, Hinduism is my team, if you support the other team, I'm going to hit you on the head with my placard. I mean, that is not Hinduism, it's actually a betrayal of what Swami Vivekananda has taught us. He's taught us that all ways of worshipping the divine are equally valid, and he has basically said, quoting the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which says that as so many rivers, some crooked, some straight, flow in different directions and end up in the same sea, so also all forms of worship of any religion all end up in the same divine. And that message is something that Hinduism teaches us. That's how I've grown up. And in a devout household, where my father prayed every single day after his bath without any exception. That was the value system that we were brought up in. And when I published Why I'm a Hindu, with its attack on the narrowing of the Hindu faith through the Hindutva political doctrine, I must say I got a lot of people, including people not of my political inclinations, coming up to me saying how much they agreed with me. So the main difference between the two books is that the Hindu way actually is minus the politics. Whereas in Why I'm a Hindu, there's a fairly detailed disquisition on the writings of the Hindutva ideologues and what they stand for and why I reject that, which is not there in the Hindu way.
I think the heavens agree with your answer because the fans came on just while you were speaking about acceptance and secularism, and it was a relief. In terms of reading fiction, I know you're a huge P.G. Wodehouse fan.
Yes.
And I want to ask how an appreciation of humor holds you in good stead in the sphere of politics.
It doesn't. It does me a great disservice in the world of politics, but maybe that's the way it should be. I do believe that politicians should learn to laugh at themselves a little bit. We have unfortunately become a nation where the biggest human right is the right to be offended. So anything you say that you think is funny, anything you say that you think is funny will offend somebody or the other. Some of you are too young to know that, but I learned this the hard way when a BJP-inclined journalist reacted to the UPA government declaring an austerity drive by tweeting to me, Mr. Minister, does this mean you will travel cattle class? And I, having been very familiar with the expression, having lived in America the preceding couple of decades, I thought it was widely known in India too, so I replied, yes, in cattle class out of solidarity with all our holy cows. And then I went off to Africa on an official visit, and while I was in the air, the dung hit the fan. And believe me, it was not a pleasant experience for several days, with even chief ministers from my own party calling for my resignation for allegedly having insulted economy class travelers. And I mean, this kind of stuff became a problem. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi had a puckish sense of humor. And the people around him were encouraged to be humorous. So when Mahatma Gandhi was asked, what do you think about Western civilization by a British journalist, he replied, I think it would be a very good idea, which was obviously a joke, but it was a huge hit at the time. And similarly, he was asked by another British journalist whether he had been appropriately dressed when he went up in his half dhoti and his shawl to be received by the king. And Gandhiji smiled and said, I think His Majesty had on enough clothes for the two of us. Now, that sort of thing prompted Sarojini Naidu, when Mahatma Gandhi used to travel in third class, but with an entire entourage that took up the entire compartment, she made a comment. It wasn't acidic, it was funny. She said, I only wish the Mahatma knew how much it costs us to keep him in poverty. And all of these things didn't cause anyone any offense. It was just part of the humor in the political world. Nehru, when he went to America in 1949, a very Anglophile Nehru, reacted with undisguised culture shock to what he saw in America. And he said, one must never visit America for the first time. So, these kinds of humor, we just can't do it anymore. Can you imagine somebody using Sarojini Naidu's line today about Sardar Patel, the only culture he has is agriculture? Can you imagine that? It will cause all sorts of offense. So the fact is that today's world is a different world, and a propensity for humor, Woodhouseian or otherwise, does not travel well in contemporary Indian politics, particularly in a multilingual polity, because everything you say that may be vaguely funny or punny in English could end up sounding terribly elitist or snooty or even downright rude in Bengali and Gujarati and Hindi and so on.
Right. I'm glad you brought up cattle class because it, segs to the next question. Your statements, specifically your tweets, have, brought you a lot of scrutiny over the years. I think you've become a bit more careful. But, tying back to the theme for this festival, Brave New World, do you think, the ideas of self-censorship, not just censorship by other parties, but this increasing idea of self-scrutiny, self-censorship, having to watch our words because otherwise we'll be cancelled, how does that reconcile with what you think of as the Brave New World? I guess what I'm asking is, do you see a danger in cancel culture going forward?
Oh yeah, and in fact, in India today already, I would challenge the title Brave New World. I know it's a reference to the sort of march, if you like, of technology, of artificial intelligence, of social media, of all of these things that have brought us into a different kind of dystopian future. But it's not terribly brave. If you look at the mainstream media today, it shows a colossal lack of bravery in its coverage of anything that would either embarrass or anger the government of the day. So I would say that the problem we have with much of our public discourse is exactly what Anindita said. There is a reluctance to speak out too much and to express your convictions precisely for fear that it will invite retribution, either from the authorities, especially the tax authorities, or from the cops. Who love to file sedition cases left, right, and center, or from angry trolls on social media. And so people say, who wants the bother? If you don't want the heat, stay out of the kitchen. Don't bother to say all these things. And that's where the self-censorship comes from. I must say that I think that's most unfortunate. I push the envelope much more than most, but even I'm guilty occasionally of watching my words simply because I don't need the grief anymore.
We're going to break soon for a few questions from the students, but, just watching you kind of so, aesthetically skim through different topics, jump from one frame of reference to the other, just reminds me that you've been an avid quizzer. You founded the St. Stephen's Quizzing Club in 1974.
Yep, first ever quiz club in any college in India. We founded it in 1974. I'm proud to say that pretty much every college now seems to have a quiz club. So that was a trend I'm proud to
Why
start.
is quizzing important? And, why should students at Alliance University, be avid quizzers or attend quizzes? Is it so that they can, kind of jump frames of reference like you have so smoothly? Or, what does it teach us?
Well, I think it, I don't want to exaggerate its importance because my enthusiasm for quizzing was greater in college than it is today.
Okay.
Largely because quizzing does impart a lot of useless knowledge, useless information, masquerading as knowledge. But the truth is that college particularly is a time to explore your curiosity to the fullest. And quizzing, by exposing you to so many different issues at a level of unusual detail, I think gives your mind a kind of extensive workout, which can stand you in good stead, as well as opens other worlds of possibility to you, which you may or may not choose to explore later. That's up to you. But if you do decide that something you discovered through a quizzing experience or through preparing for a quizzing experience was something you didn't know earlier and you are interested to find out more, that actually opens a new door mentally for you, and you could do that. I think that today, the quality of our college quizzes, I was invited to be a guest quizmaster at my own college. I think it was 40 years anniversary of my founding of the quiz club. And I found that the questions were far tougher, far more imaginative and far more demanding than anything we set at the time that I ran the quiz club. So there's a lot being done. I think if you enjoy it, do it. It certainly enhances your capacity for memory and instantaneous recall. It does, as you say, multiply your frames of reference, and it does open new possibilities to you. But at some point, honestly, you outgrow it.
Thank you for that. We have time to take a few student questions. Do we have a mic going around?
Good morning, Dr. Tharoor. I'm not exactly a student, but my question...
We're always students. I'm still a student. We're always learning.
Well, in that sense, yes. I have a question about one of your older works, maybe something that you started off this decade of writing with, Pax Indica. In that, you talk about how India should emerge as a power, a force to reckon within the global stage by leveraging and building upon its soft power and making use of smart policies like multi-alignment, something I think is gaining a lot of traction right now.
Yes, belatedly.
So, how do you, when you look back, how has it panned out? Are you happy?
I'm happy and unhappy, and I'll explain why. Yes, I did argue that it was time for us to go beyond non-alignment to multi-alignment. My argument basically is that the geopolitical world is actually like the World Wide Web, in that we are no longer in binaries. The Cold War is over. We are in a networked world where countries are connected to each other for different purposes. I may be connected to you, you may be connected to her, but I may not be connected to her, and so on and so forth. So you've got multiple things. So I used a number of examples to underscore my point. India's foreign minister meets every year with the Russian and the Chinese counterparts in something called RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and the South Africans and meets in BRICS. Then he subtracts the Russians and the Chinese and meets with the others in IPSA for South-South cooperation. Then he adds the Chinese but not the Russians to meet in BASIC for environmental negotiations. And this is not only because India has the great merit of its name beginning with that indispensable element in any acronym, a vowel, but also because we have a valuable contribution to make in each format, and we have something to gain from each format. Just as we are clamoring for a permanent seat in the Security Council amongst an elite group of 5 or 6 countries, and at the same time, we want to advance the questions of global cooperation in much larger groups. We lead the non-aligned movement, for example, though one could argue it's becoming less relevant, where we are railing against Western colonialism, but then we also join the community of democracies alongside the very Western powers we're criticizing in the non-aligned movement. We are a major power in the G77, which is the global trade union of developing countries, but we are also a member of the G20, which is the global management on macroeconomic questions, and so on and so forth. I can give you multiple examples. So I said, in this world, multi-alignment makes no sense. It didn't catch on when I said it as a minister. It didn't catch on when I said it in Pax Indica. But just this year, Foreign Minister Jaishankar was gracious enough to use the word and to credit me for it. So I'm quite happy about that. Now, having said that, has India taken on enough of the sort of role? I think only partly. And one of the things that disappointed me greatly, and I've been quite outspoken on this, was our rather mealy-mouthed stand on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I just thought that it, especially our initial statements, completely betrayed every principle we had stood for in world affairs for the last 7.5 decades. And though subsequently we corrected our statements, we still showed a great reluctance to take a stand. Whereas the UN Charter has been violated, the country has been invaded, force has been used, all of these atrocities have been committed, and we have stayed silent on it. It seems to me that we have let ourselves down. Equally, why are we clamoring for a permanent seat on the Security Council when even with a temporary seat we don't have the courage to express an opinion on a matter that shakes the world up?
Yesterday, I read the great article you wrote in Hindu and here. You
Which one, sir? I do one a month.
again. But how in India to work together today when religion and gods have disturbed everything? So I have decided to challenge the United Nations. I am going next month to stand in front of the United Nations Assembly. Abolish veto power.
So abolish?
Veto power. Veto power. The 5-member veto. They have no right to be there. Second, create a world government for the world. What do you say about it? Thank you very much.
So you are clearly an idealist, and I wish you well, but I'm afraid that there is no traction. There is no traction, and least of all at the United Nations, which, don't forget, is a body of sovereign states that are deeply attached to their own sovereignty. They're not about to give up their sovereignty to a world government. We spent 200 years fighting for our sovereignty. We're not going to give it up. The same with the Americans, the same with the Chinese. Every country is determined to preserve its own sovereign power. So I'm afraid these ideas have existed. There was a famous one world movement in the 1940s and in the early 1950s. The reason they've all faded away is that we are not able to get away from the idea of sovereign states. And therefore, honestly, I think it's better to try and get countries to cooperate with each other than to surrender their sovereignty to an absolute overlord, which they will not be willing to do. So I just want to give you that piece of disappointing news, but your idealism is entirely welcome. As I say, it won't work, least of all in the UN, because the UN is by definition a body of states, but it's a good thought.
Dr. Tharoor is happy to take a couple of more questions. Yes, the gentleman in yellow. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Tharoor. So this is our... So I have one last question for you. So this is in reference, as you said, your book, Why I'm a Hindu, earned appreciation from your political opponents. Another thing which earned appreciation from no less the Prime Minister was the Oxford Union speech. So there as we all know that you have very valiantly pursued the thesis of how dark the British era was, lest we forget it. And it's just that I would like to just pull a classic trick of trade of any historian to ask you a counterfactual, which is to say that, which is something which Niall Ferguson, the historian, poses, that had it not been the British and had it been the Dutch instead, then we wouldn't even have had the legacy of railways and democracy with us. So if we were to actually had to choose between one colonizer versus the other, was it not the best of the worst worlds in that case?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't choose any colonizer.
Thank you.
But Neil Ferguson's ignorance about India and Indian history comes up in that particular analogy because the Dutch were clobbered by Martanda Varma of Travancore in the Battle of Colachel in 1741. When they did try to invade India, they were beaten both at sea and on land. And the defeat was so complete and humiliating that the Dutch commander, Eustace de Lannoy, was captured and then entered the service of the Travancore Maharaja as his artillery commander. So the Dutch wouldn't have had a chance if they tried to take us on, in my view. And it's been proven by what happened. Now, I enjoy counterfactuals just for the hell of them because my speculation is as valid as your speculation or Professor Ferguson's speculation. But I would argue that if the British hadn't come or hadn't been allowed to grow and expand the way they did, that we would probably have ended up not very different from Japan. That is, the Marathas were already expanding throughout India. They were parking subordinate rulers everywhere. So Shambhaji was ruling in Tanjavur, which is why Sambar was invented to please his palate, which many people don't realize. Sambar was invented for a Maratha, not by us South Indians for ourselves. And you had the Mughal emperor essentially serving as a hostage of the Marathas. The Marathas told him what to say, what to do, what firman to issue, what seal to apply. The only thing that clobbered the Marathas were two things. The third battle of Panipat, where Ahmed Shah Abdali hammered the Marathas, and the Maratha ditch that stopped them taking the riches of Bengal. The Maratha ditch built by the British East India Company. So if there was no British, I believe that whatever happened in India would have been something like the Japanese shogunate, where you would have had a constitutional monarch, the Mughal emperor would be the symbol and figurehead, the real power would be in the hands of Maratha warriors, there would be Peshwas sort of all over the country, controlling provinces, and eventually, as happened in Japan, they would, I hope, begin to modernize and democratize by the 20th century. What's interesting is, however, the notion that you needed to be colonized to have railways. There are lots of countries in the world that bought and paid for railways without going to the trouble and expense of being colonized. So I'm quite sure that that is more likely, my theory is a lot more likely than the Dutch, who had just been humiliated in the Battle of Kolachel, actually taking over the whole of India. I think that they tried from the south, couldn't make it up. No chance. The British tried in Bengal, in Onindata's homeland, and did somewhat better because you all know the history. I'm not going to go there.
Some treacherous Bengalis.
Some treacherous. And Nawabs helped them.
I know there was a student question about the great Indian novel. If that student is here, could we have that? I think we must speak about the great Indian novel when we have Dr. Tharoor on stage. If that person isn't here, we can take another one.
So if you don't mind, can I ask you a question, sir?
Somebody has a mic, we may as well hear him.
Okay, great.
I got the mic with so much hurdle, so I'm going to ask you a question. So, so I'm very overwhelmed to see you here, first of all. You are my idol.
Thank you, sir.
So I have a very simple question for you. What is happening in India? What is just like really happening in India? In this age, we should discuss about education, healthcare. We should discuss about infrastructure. But aren't we discussing about bulldozer politics? Aren't we discussing about religion, Hindutva and all? When will this India change? When will India be great? When will India be great again, sir? That's
I think
my question.
Your and my heart is in the same place. I have dismissed these stories as weapons of mass distraction, which have been deliberately promoted by the ruling establishment to keep people from discussing the real problems facing this country. We have the highest unemployment figures since unemployment was ever recorded. We have the highest inflation in over a decade or two. We are looking at a country in which the social fabric is being torn asunder by the injection of a toxic mentality that divides people on the basis of their communal identities and that encourages both physical and psychological violence against people because of something they can't help, the faith they were born into. It's a tragic situation. And at least people like you who have the benefit of education and knowledge should be able to stand up against this in your own families, in your own communities, in your own social media, in your own university classrooms. Because if not, it is the very character and nature of our country, established over thousands of years of civilization, that is being torn asunder for the short-term, petty political gains of a party of mere mortals. It's a really tragic development. It is much, much worse in North India than here in the South, but I've been saddened to see Karnataka being distracted by hijab and halal and azan and God knows what else will now be dragged into the open because an election is looming early next year in this state. To my mind, this is the worst thing about our politics, is that it has brought out some of the worst instincts in people. And things that were not even considered polite to express in the privacy of your own living room when I was growing up are now being openly declaimed on public platforms and on with loudspeakers. It's shocking and shameful, and I think all of us have a duty to stand up against it. I'm almost tired of saying this because I write so often and speak so often against it, and it seems to make no impact whatsoever. But the truth is, if we all did so, we multiplied our voices and stood up for decency, for just decent human behavior with each other, we would create a much better country for you and your next generation to grow up in.
I think we could be here all day with you, and Dr. Tharoor is being very generous with his time, but Dr. Anirudh is, I think, signaling to me that it's time to wrap up. But, you know, you can reach out and read a lot of Dr. Tharoor's work on various platforms. Can we go on, or you tell me? Okay. Unfortunately, we
give
do
one
have
question
to
to a
wrap
lady,
up.
because we've had a bit of
Yes.
gender imbalance here.
Okay. So you.
Hello.
You pick.
Yeah.
Let the lady pick the lady, then I'm safe.
No, she's already standing, so we'll give it to her. Yes.
Hi, Tharoor. Huge fan of your hair, I must say. I wish I had it. Anyway, so I'm trying to ask something for which I've been searching for an answer. So first of all, let me introduce myself. I am an alumni from this college. I did my MBA in Alliance University, and I'm extremely proud to be here in the seat. So my question is, when you think of authors like Marquis de Sade and painters like Picasso and poets like Pablo Neruda, and their works are much appreciated. But however, the human being themselves, they are very bad. They are abusers, they are harassers, right? So this question has been in my mind for a long time because I am an artist myself, and I would want to know your perspective on art versus an artist. Like, as you said, art is something that a person puts out in person, right? So when a person like Marquis de Sade, who's the world's first sadist from France, is putting out literature like 120 Days of Sodom, and it is appreciated. But at the same time, when I'm buying the book, I feel guilty that I'm being appreciative of an artwork that is very sadist, but at the same time, it's a literature, it's beauty, it's art. But however, the person is a sadist. So I want to know your perspective on art versus artist, when the artist is, it's not a person who you can appreciate.
No, it's a very good question because it's an old controversy which has existed for over a century. The classic answer that the artists like to give is, trust the work, not the worker. Trust the art, not the artist. In other words, the artist may be reprehensible, slovenly, unshaven, full of bad breath, hasn't showered in 3 weeks, but has produced a masterpiece. Enjoy the masterpiece, don't think about the artist. That is essentially the classic idea. But I still believe that there is no one-size-fits-all answer. And particularly, it depends on the individual themselves. For some people, their appreciation, for example, of a book, a work of writing, a work of literature, is inseparable from what they imagine the creator of that book to be, what the persona that inhabits the voice of the writer is. And if the real persona turns out to be very different from what they'd imagined, their disappointment is understandable and will color their appreciation of the work. So to my mind, while you might ideally say that the greatness of the book speaks for itself and the writer may be an unprintable four-letter word, but the book is great, I think that for some readers that's not good enough. And there will be readers who will say that for them, they are disappointed because they found out more about the writer. And I think, honestly, both approaches are equally fair and equally valid. I mean, as a kid, I remember, for example, liking the music of Eric Clapton. And when I discovered he was a supporter of the British racist National Front and had said foul things about black and brown people, I could never hear his music again. So it's simply a question of how you relate to certain things and what matters to you. I mean, I actually enjoyed, for example, Kipling's poem If as a young child. There was an entire movie made with the title If by Lindsay Anson, which I loved. And then I discovered more about Kipling, his absolutely appalling racist imperial views, and even the circumstances in which this poem was written, which was written in defense of a white officer who had massacred a lot of Zulus in a war against the blacks in Southern Africa. And I just could not think of Kipling's poetry the same way again. So for me, some of these things are relevant, but there will be other things. After all, when you're ignorant about the artist, why can't you appreciate the art? When you're ignorant about the musician, why can't you appreciate the musician? It depends on how important it is for you to know the personal qualities of the person, and let it be a subjective choice for each of you to make.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anindya. You've been a wonderful audience. I'm really sorry, but there's a program that has to keep going on. Thank you all very much.
A huge round of applause for Dr. Tharoor and Anindita.